Hello everyone, I'm Matt Simpson. I'm the Managing Director at Candyspace. Today we are talking personalisation, why you need to do it, how to do it, what technology you need, and how to not make a complete disaster of it. Luckily, I have a personalisation expert, maybe guru, with me, Damien Read, currently at Britbox, formerly of ITV, BT, many other places. Damien, welcome. Perhaps you could just tell us a bit more about your current role and what you've been up to.
Hi, and thanks for inviting me on. Yes, I've had a career almost entirely in TV. Digital TV was a new thing 20 years ago, and on-demand was a new thing, and I've been through all those waves, and I've worked at places like Sky, NowTV, and BT, as you mentioned. About 5 or 6 years ago, we moved down to Bath, and I joined a personalisation company there, and actually ran it for 2 or 3 years, and managed to sell that. And then went to work, as you said, for ITV, helping them with personalisation. And I'm now at Britbox, also helping them with personalisation, very much in the TV space.
Brilliant. So every time I read a study or a survey about personalisation, it will say that when you ask consumers, they all demand it. They would say, you know, I am let down if a brand is not delivering personalised experiences to me. However, as a consumer myself, I rarely see genuine, excellent personalised experience is in my life. Like I see the sledgehammer of segmentation, but I'm not seeing it as much as perhaps the studies suggest should be happening. Why is that?
Again, answering from the TV space, there is a lot of personalisation going on of it. Some of it's very subtle, some of it's very overt. In fact, I would say that personalisation is table stakes now across the whole OTT industry. So it is happening. You've got the extreme where Netflix is very personalised, and you've got other extremes that are, less personalised. Historically, TV has been very dominated by editorial teams, so there has been, reluctance for editorial teams to let go, but that has all changed in the last 5 years at least, if not further ago. Consumers only really answer that question when they see overt personalisation. So on a TV service, you'd see a recommended for you because you watched. But actually, if you look at Netflix, every single rail is personalised. In fact, the rails you receive are personalised, so it's a lot more subtle. So I would challenge consumers, do they really know what they are being personalised, and can they really explain it? Most companies are now, most OTT TV companies are personalising to some degree.
I think it's certainly true that TV or streaming has been at the forefront of personalisation. I think other sectors may have a lot to learn from them.
Yes, to some degree. I mean, personalization requires data. You've got to have data about the consumers. So lots of companies don't have quite enough data to generate the sort of personalization you need. In fact, that's a theme throughout my personalization career, is getting the right data. So for TV personalization, you've got to have user data, user watch history, and ideally navigation as well. And then you've also got to have really rich metadata about the content. Until you've got those, personalization really won't move the dial. But when you have got those, it really does move the dial. So,
is it that businesses don't have the data, or is it that they're not stitching the data together and not utilizing the data in the right way?
It's hard for me to speak outside the TV industry, but I do know I went to a conference recently where there's a lot of e-commerce companies, and they were saying, well, we can't do personalization because most users on our site are anonymous, so we don't know anything about them. So that is a massive barrier, to your point. Yes, they haven't got the data. The stitching together is relatively simple in inverted commas. I don't think that's the issue. I think it's just getting the data up front from the vast majority of anonymous users. But if you're logged in, if you've bought from a service before, you should be able to personalize and stitch it together relatively easily.
Okay, so if we accept that consumers are demanding personalization, what are the key things that any business should consider when trying to deliver on those expectations for its customers?
So the key things you've got to consider as a business for personalization is, as just said, the data is the bedrock. Bad data in, the classic quote, bad data out. So you have to work incredibly hard to make sure that the user events, or whatever you're triggering for the users to understand what they are doing, is coming through quickly and clearly. But also the content metadata has to be really, really enriched. The biggest single thing I hear from people who want to personalize in the TV space is, oh, my metadata is rubbish. It's a universal truth across all services. Now that's starting to change, of course. Channel 4 has really good metadata now, and other companies do. In fact, there's some interesting companies in this space who are enhancing your metadata from AI. There's a great company in Sweden called Vion Labs, and they take the raw video and they generate this incredibly rich taxonomy of data from it. And once you have that, you can start to say, oh, look, Matt's watched shows with futuristic, dark, I don't know, whatever, I can't make, and you'll be able to match that to other content in the service and match it a lot better. So that really generates personalization. And when I've done that at companies, it mostly works. Sometimes it doesn't, but it mostly works. And that's one of the bedrocks. The second is choosing the right data science model. And this is something that doesn't quite come out in the sales pitches, but there's lots of different types of models out there. Now, in terms of large language models, that isn't where we're playing here. We're playing in sort of machine learning, data science end of it, so old AI to some degree. But still, you've got to make sure the model's tuned, it's learning. At one company I worked for, a model called collaborative filtering worked incredibly well, but that's the equivalent to the Amazon, because you bought this, you might like this. It's pattern recognition. It just goes, Damien watched a sports program and a movie, so I'm going to predict that to the same person. That worked really well at one company. I tried that at a new company I arrived at. It didn't work. And metadata to metadata matching, content to content matching worked much better. So you've got to play around with the model. And that leads me on to my third, I think the most important ingredient is just testing. You don't know what works to test. This is a data-rich environment. Every company I go to, we set up a testing AB or ABC environment, and that's the only way you know what works. And some stuff doesn't work, as I just said, but a lot of it does.
Okay. One of the key pieces of kit, I assume, is a modern CMS to be able to deliver the personalized experiences across different regions, to different audiences, to different customer segments. How does it do that, and how does it enhance your ability?
Well, when I saw that question, I sort of said no, actually, interestingly, because in the TV world that I know, the CMS system is from one vendor, and the recommendation system is from another vendor, and plugging those together is often really, really hard. In fact, a great example is one of the rails that works really well for personalization. By rail, I mean the sort of, the line of content you see on all TV services. One of those is called Because You Watched, and it's because you watched Vera, because you watched Coronation Street, whatever you want to put in there, you put the title in there. And getting that title to go from the recommendation partner back into the CMS partner is always really, really painful. Wherever I've worked, it never really works. So
why?
Because the CMS partner isn't set up for a dynamic, changing world where it's highly personalized. They're used to, most CMS solutions are designed for an editor, where an editor picks a list and goes, here's my 20 titles, display them. Now you're moving to a world of personalization where you don't know what that list is. It's different for you, different for me, the heading's different. So working in that world is very different. Now I'm starting to see a trend where these worlds are getting closer and closer together, but they need to get much closer, especially in the TV space. The CMS needs to work really tightly with the recommendation provider. They're normally separate if they're of any quality.
Interesting. So how do you bridge that gap?
I suspect there'll be strategic alignment soon where vendor one will say we've aligned with CMS vendor one will align with recommendation vendor two, whatever, and they'll start to align. If you have a strong API framework as well, a sort of abstraction layer until you can get around it, but still I think strategic partnerships are how I see it going. I do know of a couple of vendors out there, TiVo and 24i, who are down this path already. They're starting to have, we've got an integrated proposition, so that's really strong, so that people are starting to integrate them together. But I think it's a direction of travel you've got to go down. And interestingly, the main users of recommendation services, the main target audience within a business is an editorial team. So you've got to make it work for editorial. They want to set it up, they want to preview, they want to see, if I watch that show, how does my recommendations change? So you've got to give people a lot of confidence around that. So you need a tool that looks like a CMS, but isn't quite. It can preview recommendations. So the two worlds are colliding in my view.
That makes sense. Like, how do you deliver that personalized content at massive scale?
The scale, yeah, interesting. The scale is important. Data quality is the first thing to get right there, and to check it and make sure you've got all the alerts and something for scale. But going from 100,000 user service to 1 million user service, I've very rarely seen that be a stumbling block for many companies. Most recommendation providers out there are built on AWS cloud. or another cloud provider, and they are just set up for mass scale. They really are. That's the only way they work. So you think about it, if you're everyone that goes to your homepage, say you've got 10 rails on there serving 20 recommendations, you're quickly getting to hundreds of millions of recommendations a day, a week, whatever, even for the relatively small services. But ITV has mammoth amount of traffic going to its homepage, and it's able to cope with a lot of personalization on there. So scale's never been an issue, but of course you've got to build for it and structure for it, which most vendors have, I think.
You touched on this before, that tension between human curation and editorialization versus data-generated personalized content. Like, how do you manage that tension?
Well, it shouldn't be a tension is the answer. So when I first started at NowTV doing this, we had an email and we wanted to personalize it. We had a great editorial brand team, and we had an American early AI company saying we can personalize this email better for you. And we had this battle. The editorial team sent out one, we sent out one. We looked at open rates and watch rates, and they were pretty comparable, to be frank. A good editorial team knows its stuff, and a good AI knows its stuff. And then many years later, the penny dropped for me. That was absolutely the wrong question. You don't want to ask who's better. You want to ask who can work together. And this is, I think, the second most important point to make today. That is when personalization works better than anything else, is when you get editorial team to work with personalization. So a large number of successful personalized experiences on TV, an editorial team will pick 20, 30 items of content, and all the AI is doing is reordering it for you and excluding content you've already watched, which makes a big difference. So that is the sweet spot. So, an example might be you want a period rail, period drama, period mysteries. The editors go through their catalog, they select 20 items that are in there, popular good stuff, they know they're in the right space, and then you give that to the recommendation company and they go, okay, Damien's watched particular type of period drama, we're going to put that first, and he's watched 2 shows, we're going to put those at the end. And that's all you're doing is reordering, and that's where personalization, that's where you see the biggest uplift in KPI metrics, watch metrics.
Just to play devil's advocate, couldn't you argue that AI-driven recommendation engine could choose those 20 titles better than the humans in the first place?
Well, I've tested that and it doesn't. So we absolutely did that. So when you launch these models, we tested pure collaborative filtering, pure recommendations like you just mentioned, editorial, and we had a whole suite of tests, and the one that always wins in my experience is, except for certain cases, but mostly, is what we call the editorial sort, where the editors pick it and you sort it. And you can see the data, you can see click-through rates from all those different rails or different versions of the experiment, so yeah.
Why do you think that is?
The richness, it's the content metadata is where you need to get better. So you could argue one day when we really understand content in a way that we don't at the moment, it will be better than editors. But an editor is still best at saying, these are the best 20 shows that fit, British TV, they're the best, or you might have, sports highlights. Editors are still best at picking that content. The metadata isn't quite rich enough yet to really work. Now there is a big exception to that. There's a model called collaborative filtering. I know that sounds very geeky, but this is the model where it's the Amazon model. So you pick patterns. If someone's watched a movie, a sports, and a documentary, then someone else who's done that will have the same watching pattern. So it doesn't rely on the content metadata. It purely looks at patterns within data. And for certain companies I've worked at, particularly where there's a large genre spread, so you do have sports and documentaries, that works much, much better, and that doesn't require editorial input. So it's horses for courses, but overall, editorial sorts where editors and AI work together is the sweet spot at the moment, yes.
Do you see that changing though?
We have looked at this, and we've had really incredibly rich metadata that's the best out there at the moment, and it didn't really, wasn't as good as an editor. So I think it's here for 10 years, but maybe there'll be a company comes along that can really get under the skin of what show do you like. But at the moment, the sweet spot is definitely editors plus AI, and it will be for 5 to 10 years, I expect.
I'm wondering, isn't human curation though a self-fulfilling prophecy? So if you are working at Netflix and decide to put a particular show as the #1 most watched show, I don't know if they can corrupt it like that, but anyway, let's say that they can. People are going to assume that so many other people watching it, it must be good, and they'll watch it and it becomes self-fulfilling.
So any recommendation system uses popularity to rank things, absolutely. So it'll say, oh, this in the last week or whatever, this show is trending, we'll move it to the front. But it still personalizes it for you. If you're never going to watch it, no matter how popular it is, it doesn't put it at the front. Now, to your question, you need something to seed that. So in my experience, the hero or the top of the homepage, that will always be an editorially selected rail. You would never, very rarely would you start to personalize that. So you'd have the big show that you've spent a lot of money on, the tent pole being there, and if it works and generates a lot of popularity, it will naturally feed into all the algorithmic rails below. And there is the other way around, actually. There's a very great example recently where there was a show on one of the services, one of the companies I'm working for, that wasn't really seen as that popular, but it was picked up by the recommended for you rail, and it jumped right up to the top for a lot of people just because it met the criteria of what a lot of people wanted in terms of the metadata, and it got to third or fourth in the recommended for you rail. Then more and more people watched it, so it got more popular, and then it was picked up by the most popular rail, and now the editorial team has seen that and they've put it back up into the hero. So it can work that way around as well. But you're absolutely right, you need something to seed popularity on a service, and that will never really be generated by an algorithm. It'll always be a pure editorial rail.
But is there not a future where, for example, the algorithm understands how much a business might have invested in buying that piece of content, the return it needs on that, therefore the number of eyeballs it needs, the amount of subscriptions or ads it needs to sell off the back of it, and is just doing all of that job for the humans?
So I'm working with somebody at the moment that is looking at that as if you're a content acquisition team at the moment, how do you know how this show is going to work? Surely you can use the same recommendation engine to say, oh, this is really popular, right? Or will be really popular. That is right at the cutting edge of where the TV industry is at the moment. So I would be very loath to go to a content acquisition guy and say, I can predict how popular this show will be on your service. Now you can do it to some degree, but it's very, very hard. But that is exactly where the industry is going. But there is still a magic in content, right? There are still shows that I know services out there spend a lot of money on that just don't trend highly. And there's the other extreme where shows that shouldn't do very well, like a documentary on post offices, for example, does incredibly well. So you can never quite predict it. And you need that responsive mechanism within the algorithms to promote what's working and less lower promotion for the stuff that isn't quite working. So
do you have those moments working in TV where everyone's just scratching their heads and going, why is everyone watching that? None of the data's telling us this.
They're rare. Most of the time, content acquisition teams know what they're doing. They buy content, it generally works. And as you said, it's a bit self-fulfilling because you put it in #1 slot on the hero, so it will do quite well. But then within that, there's always 10, 20% up or down. That show should have done that, it's a little bit worse, or that show was there, and it goes up and down a lot. So there is some variation in that, but there is some magic stardust in certain shows work. The characters, the plot, the setting suddenly kicks in and works really, really well for people. And it is AI can't predict that yet. Maybe one day.
I'm thinking about the increasing and very recent popularity of fast channels, where actually it feels like some consumers at least, or many consumers sometimes, are moving away from the idea of having a sort of highly personalized experience and just want to sit back and be broadcast to. I wonder if people are feeling there's too much personalization and tailoring.
Yeah, I don't think that's a personalization question. I think that's a sort of navigation ease of choice. So, fast channels, particularly in the States, are working because people just sit down, up, down, choose. So it's a very quick experience in terms of choosing a bit of content to watch. They're also clearly free in the States, so that's a massive part of their success story. There is still a question of how popular fast channels will be outside of the States, where you've got a lot of free-to-air television anyway. That's what we receive through the air or through broadband at the moment is a lot of free channels here in the UK. Having said that, you can personalize a fast channel. A lot of people are doing that. So, if you put a series of VOD assets back to back, you could have a personalized fast channel for you or for a target audience that can narrow down. And I don't think that's a personalization. I think that's a fast channels are growing because it's just such a simple choice. And people, when they want to watch TV, are generally in the mood for just lean back, classic lean back experience. I don't want to make too many decisions. When you've got to navigate up or down and go around and everything. But part of the KPIs that I always track with the companies I work for is how quickly can you get the right content in front of somebody. So I mean, that is one of the goals, and one of the big success stories of personalization is reducing that time or reducing the number of clicks to get there, and that definitely has personalization works incredibly well on that. So a lot of TV services have a recommended for you rail within the top 5. That'll be highly personalized. That should be grabbing you for stuff. If you haven't watched the most popular or original, you should be getting to that rail. And so that is where, I would like to argue a personalized on-demand experience should get better and better, and mean that fast channels, you don't need that experience because it's becoming more quicker and easier to find the right content for you, basically.
So working on personalization within the streaming space, how have you managed to justify the investment into that against tangible business results and a return on that investment?
Very easily, actually. If you look at an advertising funded channel, right, it's very easy to do the maths and say a 5-10% increase in viewing equals this amount of money, and the equation is always relatively positive for an advertising funded business. For SVOD, it's a little bit more tricky because you have to show, you can clearly show incremental viewing, but does the link to will they less churn? That is the harder link to make. But again, we do a lot of maths, a lot of insight and analytics around that, and you can often show, in fact most times I've done it, you show that there is a clear increase in lowering of retention, so customers staying longer because they're watching more because of personalization. You can make that link. So yes, it's a good, the maths behind, the finances behind personalization is normally very positive.
And how do you see, with the pace of change of technology and the ability to drive even more sophisticated personalized recommendations, what do you see changing over the next 2 or 3 years?
The big one for me, and this links to your question earlier about CMSs as well, is I think vertical personalization is really, really important. So at all the companies I work for, we spend a lot of time going, what's the first rail? What's the second rail? What's the third rail in the service, going down? Where in reality, again, a good personalization provider has that data. They know that Damien never clicks on the new to Britbox rail, for example, but I always click on the crime rail. So that crime rail should move up and the new to Britbox should move down for me. And that is, companies offer that right now. There are vendors out there that absolutely provide that, but getting that to work with a CMS, getting that to work with the editorial team is getting there. It's close for a lot of companies. And I know there's some companies in Asia that are doing that 100% personalized experience. Netflix says they do that as well. So that is a direction of travel I see, personalizing the actual layout of the homepage in particular. Also, personalization is linking up with marketing. So far, I've just talked about the on-screen experience, but actually you want the whole experience to be linked together. So if I'm sending you an email with some recommendations on, they should be the same as the recommendations you see on the screen. That is definitely happening now across a lot of companies, but it could go faster and be even more aligned, I think, is an area I see we're moving into.
Okay. And final question. So we talked a bit about the fact that I think streaming is probably ahead of most other sectors in terms of the sophistication of its personalization. Can you offer any advice to other leaders in other sectors who recognize that they need to be better at this, but may be struggling to understand where to start?
Yeah, great question. I'd say the key thing is pick just one experience that you want to personalize. Make sure the data is really strong and clean and you've got the right content data in there to make the recommendations, and then set up a testing culture where you've got not personalized against personalized, see what works. Personalization will probably work, then different models do better, and keep that testing culture going for that one experience and really prove it within the business. Because it's very easy to be skeptical about personalization, as you said, but actually if you see the data and you see a 10-20% uplift sometimes from one rail, that's incredible, then people just can't argue against that and go, right, that personalization is working. So it's a series of gradual wins where the data shows you and the KPI increase is showing that it's working.
That's really interesting. It's interesting you touched on that being a cultural and a mindset approach within a business. like to value testing, to
Yeah.
recognize that, you know,
Well, I always
that's
think the
gonna,
TV industry is behind on testing, but even other people I've talked to, it isn't. Maybe it's ahead. I don't know, but yeah, getting that testing culture where you can say, "Oh, that didn't work, guys. Okay, great." That's quite hard for people because they want everything to work and be a success. But getting the culture where you can say that worked, that didn't, and you grow through that. And a couple of companies I've worked for recently have a very, very strong testing culture, and it's great. It really makes a difference, actually. The data talks. No one can argue against it. You know, it's a very quick meeting, right?
amazing. That's been fascinating. If you're watching this video, the version you're watching is highly personalized to you, I should say, and someone else is watching a different version. It's been really fascinating. Thanks, Damien. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for asking me. It's been
Thank you.
great.